Thank you. Thank you to Eric, and thank you to the sponsors of the lecture series, and most of all, thank you to you all for coming out on a Friday afternoon. You're obviously the hardcore group, so I have high expectations for our conversation. So you should have a handout, and it will have the text we're going to focus on today. Two things you need to look at. One, you'll need to have access to John chapter 9, and you'll also see on your handout a list of resources, further resources for this subject. And I'll be reading a couple of long quotes here in a second, and a couple of those are on your handout as well. So my apologies to the folks who are here this morning. The first 3 or 4 minutes are going to be the same because I have to kind of bring folks up to speed on the language that we'll be using in our conversation for the next hour. So in John 9:1, the disciples asked Jesus, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" When talking about the Bible and disability, Carrie Wynn says this, and I quote, "The two most common assumptions in popular theology that marginalize people with disabilities are, 1, disability is caused by sin, and 2, if one has enough faith, one will be healed." So I spend a lot of time talking about this, thinking about it, and writing about it, and in this new book that he was just referring to, this Reading John, on page 63, I say this: from a disability perspective, what are the promises and pitfalls of our texts? In what ways does the text have liberative potential, and in what ways does it present obstacles for those seeking abundant life? And that's a quote from John 10:10. So entering this conversation involves 1, learning some new language, 2, noticing and modifying our assumptions, and 3, acting to create more inclusive environments, more inclusive communities. So what we're going to do is just kind of have a sample of this conversation. I hope to hear more about, what brought you all here and what questions you're seeking answers to, or what conversations you're seeking to have. So in terms of definitions, it's important to start out with a couple of them. So if you'll turn to the page that has some terms, definitions, and distinctions on it, I want to begin the conversation with a kind of tricky, weird word that's normate. Okay, so when we talk about disability, we are talking about disability and impairments, right? We're talking about what language people would normally call a normal body, right? But there is no such thing as a normal body, because bodies come in all different shapes, sizes, colors, freckles, no freckles, genders, etc., right? So scholars, based on Rosemary Garland Thompson, use the term normate to talk about that kind of socially constructed ideal body. So she says this is the kind of famous quote it comes from. "As I examine the disabled figure," she says, "I will also trouble the mutually constituting figure this study coins, the normate. This neologism," which is a word meaning new word, "names the veiled subject position of cultural self, the figure outlined by the array of deviant others whose marked bodies shore up the normate's boundaries. The term normate usefully designates the social figure through which people can represent themselves as definitive human beings. Normate, then, is the constructed identity of those who, by way of the bodily configurations and cultural capital they assume, can step into a position of authority and wield the power it grants them. If one attempts to define the normate position by peeling away all the marked traits within the social order at this historical moment, what emerges is a very narrowly defined profile that describes only a minority of actual people. Irving Goffman, whose work I discuss in greater detail later," she says, "observes the logical conclusion of this phenomenon by noting wryly that there is, quote, only one complete, unblushing male in America, a young, married, white, urban, northern, heterosexual, Protestant father of college education, fully employed, of good complexion, weight, and height, and a recent record in sports," end quote. So that's the first kind of word that you'll come across if you start reading around in disability studies. So sometimes the word disability is used synonymously with the word impairment, but more technically speaking, an impairment is a deviation from what I just said, the normate body, right? So anybody who has a kind of different body, that's an impairment, right? Now, this impairment may or may not cause a problem for the impaired person. The impairment may or may not cause pain. The person may or may not find a cure necessary if there is no pain or suffering. The word disability is reserved for the suffering and injustice that come from the way society treats a person with an impairment. In other words, society disables people with impairments. So someone may be born with no legs and need a wheelchair to move from place to place. They may be in no physical pain because of it, right? So where the disability arises is from the fact that curbs make it impossible for those in wheelchairs to access the same facilities that non-disabled people take for granted. And by the way, that they assume that they are entitled to, including civic buildings, buses, trains, even churches. How many of you have churches that if I were in a wheelchair, I could not access your choir loft? Maybe you don't have to raise your hands. But it's something to think about when you're sitting in your church, looking around. Is it actually accessible to all kinds of bodies? Or a person born blind, as in John chapter 9, may be marginalized as a sinner because of the way a society or a religion construes reality in God's favor or disfavor. So disability and impairment are two different things. One is a medical phenomenon, one is a social phenomenon. Another matter of definition has to do with cure and healing. Cure, in this essay and in the conversation, refers to the elimination of impairment and is experienced at the individual level. Healing refers to the experience of integration and reconciliation to self, God, and the community. So this is important. Healing may or may not involve a cure. So regarding assumptions, I said we have to kind of check some of our assumptions. That's certainly been my experience in the past decade. So I commend churches. So there are a lot of churches that have churches that are serving families well with ministries to families who have special needs, right? And that is, as I said this morning, very holy work. But what I'm talking about is I want to push us beyond that to recognize that every single person has been given spiritual gifts by God. Every single person who exists is spiritually gifted. So it's time now for us to be tapping people with disabilities, not just ministering to people with disabilities, tapping people for leadership in the church in the exact same way that we do with non-disabled people. So we need to be in ministry with disabled people, not just to them. And furthermore, we need to be ministered to by people with disabilities. And we need to create the physical spaces for their gifts to be enacted. So if the preacher is in a wheelchair, the pulpit can't be up a flight of stairs. Right? So this is what we're talking about, the actual practical, on-the-ground ways of creating community. So before I leave that topic, I should say, if any of you are, hopefully some of you are already interested in this conversation or you get interested, and please know that after I leave here, the conversation is not over. Okay? So email me, I'm happy to talk further, come study with me, right? Do different degree programs. I have a doctoral student right now, Lisa Hancock, who is working on disability's relationship to our understandings of sin and salvation and offering an alternative theological narrative in which disability is integral and necessary to God's life-giving work for all creation. Her spouse, Justin Hancock, who's in a wheelchair with cerebral palsy, is working on a D-Min degree on disability and sexuality. Anyway, there's lots of ways to be involved, and both of them are founders of a new community that is in the works in Dallas called the Julian Way that you can read about. And it's an intentional Christian community where non-disabled and disabled folks live together. And it focuses on community engagement and greater integration of persons with disabilities in the life of the body of Christ. So the point is we can come have ivory tower conversations, which are really fun and fascinating. I'd love to have you do that. But in the end, right, it's all aimed towards deep thought and effective action to make this world more of the good news or gospel kind of place that God has envisioned from the beginning. So turning then more closely to our topic for today, I'm going to focus on John chapter 9. So we want to look at, now today we're just going to read chapter 9 of John. There's lots of ways we could read it through lots of different lenses. Today it's just through disability. So we want to kind of pull out some observations from our reading of it, and then draw some conclusions and raise some questions about the promises and pitfalls of that text. From start to finish, and at all points in between, the fourth gospel is concerned with life, how we get it, how we lose it, how we find it again, or better yet, how we get found by it. All things came into being through him, John 1:3 says, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. 10:10, I came that they might have life and have it more abundantly. 20:31, these things have been written so that you may come to believe or continue to believe, depending on how you translate it, that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that through believing you might have life in his name. So abundant life, embodied life, eternal life, precious life. How does the fourth gospel's ethic of life play out for persons with disabilities? So John 1:14 tells us this, and the word became flesh and tabernacled among us. In a gospel committed to incarnation and its ethical implications, it makes sense to address bodies, both idealized and actual. How a text construes or constructs bodies and how interpreters, that's you and me, consequently interpret that text reveals particular cultural assumptions and even aspirations. John 9 must be interpreted in light of the material that precedes it, right, including the prologue, and we did that this morning. I'm not going to walk back through. Again, you can read that in this essay. So if we were doing a thorough job, we would start with John chapter 1 and the prologue. Okay, but we're going to skip here to chapter 9. And chapter 9 really reflects a microcosm of the concerns, assumptions, and patterns in the whole fourth gospel. It also shows a number of the different issues that I want to note, if not fully explore, including but not limited to these. The use of disability as a metaphor, in this case blindness. 2, the question of a disabled person's agency. As we read through the story, notice this guy's agency or lack of. 3, the social aspect of disability. So watch how everybody in the story reacts to him. Next, normate assumptions about persons with disabilities longing for a normate body. Okay, I'm going to say that again. So people with normate bodies, non-disabled people, have this assumption that people with various impairments are longing to have this ideal body. Okay? So we'll look for that. And then the last two I won't really get to today, but they're called, one's called narrative prosthesis, and one is called inspiration porn, and that's in quotation marks. I didn't make that up. That comes from disability activism. And those last two have to do with the way authors use disabled characters in film, novels, a variety of things. The disability gets used as a plot technique and device, and in the process kind of erases real disabled bodies. But that's a conversation for another day. We're not going to get that lofty here today. Okay, so turning to John chapter 9, let me start just by grounding you literally in, oh, you know what I have here? I forgot to put out my special thing that I brought for them all the way from Israel. So this is, how many of you have been to Israel and Palestine? Okay, one person way in the back. Did you go to the Pool of Siloam when you were there? Did you go through, you would remember, because you probably would have gone through a really skinny Hezekiah's tunnel where you were wondering if you were going to get out alive. You would remember, yeah. So this is the entrance to Hezekiah's tunnel. This right here, before you go in, this blue line shows you how high the water is. So you go and you put yourself next to it and decide whether you're going to go or not, whether you want to slog through. that water. So to get to the Pool of Siloam, if you go there today, you can go, this is called the wet tunnel. That's the entry. That's the width of it. Yeah, it's dark too. That's just lit up with my camera. And then when you come out Hezekiah's tunnel and you go into what's the old Pool of Siloam. So before 2008, if you went to the Holy Land, this is what you would have seen as the Pool of Siloam. Since then, we've discovered that's not the real Pool of Siloam. This is the real, then you walk up, go across to the real Pool of Siloam, which is this huge monumental structure with, you see all these steps going down. So literally you would walk down into the pool. So that's looking at it from the side. This is on the way down. That's where I need a pedicure, so we'll skip that. And then walking down the steps to where you get to the mud, and then all the way down to the actual mud, which I have some of in this little jar here. So if you're the kind of person like I am that's so hokey that you love to actually touch, like it's meaningful to you to touch the sand, I welcome you to take a scoop, do whatever you need to do. I brought this to share with you. So that's the real Pool of Siloam mud. And also it's not on, it will never be on your normal tour. So if you ever, when you go to Jerusalem and you want to go there, you have to, it's an exceptional thing. It's kind of a pain to get to, but not normally on a tour. So make your way there. It's a really, really holy place, one of my favorite places, along with Magdala. Okay, so the fourth gospel, of course, is a story. And what happens, the Gospel of John is really dramatic. It really lends itself to theatrical presentation. Things are often done in scenes. So what I want to do is actually read the text scene by scene and just pull out some comments about it as we go. All right, so first I want to read chapters 1 through 7 and see what we think about it. All right, as he walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned." Listen to this. "He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." When he had said this, he spat on the ground and made mud with the saliva and spread the mud on the man's eyes, saying to him, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. Then he went and washed and came back able to see. Okay, we're reading this text today for no other reason than questions of disability, so we don't care about a lot of other things. But from our vantage point, speak to me. What do you notice? What do you wonder about? What do you react to positively, negatively? Right. He's just sitting along, living his life, right? He does not seek Jesus out, right? Jesus acts upon him. And so that's a really, really important point. Something that's really interesting, if you read the Old, so Jeremy Skipper, my colleague in Old Testament, does disability studies for Old Testament. He's not the only one, but he's kind of one of the founders of the field. And something Jeremy noticed, in the Old Testament, people tend to live their whole lives with their disability or their impairment, right? In the New Testament, they get cured. And it raises a variety of issues. But yeah, so that's the question. He's acted upon without anybody even asking. Okay, what else strikes you or we need to talk about? Yes.
My daughter's blind, so like, I don't realize how much will ask her. She's right here. So it happens a lot.
Yes, so not a full person. I mean, even Lisa and Justin, whom I've spoken to you about, Justin's in a wheelchair and Lisa is able-bodied, and people will literally, right in front of Justin, ask Lisa questions about Justin. And he's neither visually impaired or hearing impaired, you know? So disabled people experience this kind of thing a lot. People will speak louder to him. If you're in a wheelchair, people will talk to you louder than normal. So there's an assumption that a physical disability is also related to a cognitive disability. So a lot of stuff goes on. People will come up if you're in a wheelchair and just move you out of the way, right? In a way that I would never just walk up and touch you, not knowing you, and move you out of my way, right? So, yes, sir.
I thought it was interesting. I mean, looking at it through this other lens, the lens here, it said almost God's hand was involved
Yeah, a lot of people haven't. Are you willing to say kind of what kind of reaction you have to that, or at a gut level, or is anybody willing to say? You just want to observe it, yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's something worth noticing and talking more about, which we're going to in a second. Yeah, because it's potentially problematic. Depending on your stance, it's either not problematic or it's highly problematic, but it's probably not anything in between. Yeah. Yes, sir. I can't quite hear you. It bugs you. Yeah, good. Yeah, okay, and why? Yeah. Yeah, good. Okay, so that's a great question, which perfectly leads me into the next point I want to make. And that's this. So we see this. Oh, and also, tell me about this. When the disciples, not only do they actually talk around the guy, they're just having an interesting conversation about this case in front of them, right? But also, what is the assumption of the disciples about why the guy is blind? Right. So they're for sure that it's sin, something to do with sin. The only thing they're puzzling over is like, was it him or his parents? But for sure, there's sin going on here, right? So that's their assumption, right? Speaking of checking assumption. And what is Jesus immediately, how does he immediately respond to this notion that it's sin that's at the root of the disability, the impairment? Right? He immediately says that's wrong. It's a wrong assumption, right? That's not what's going on here. So the facile connection between sin and impairment is checked by Jesus. But then, of course, as you all just said, he leads us into a different problem. So on your handout, you'll see, on your handout, you'll see a little table that's got these verses on it. And I'm going to try to stick to my text here to explain this to you. Okay, so Jesus' next words, if read in an English translation such as the New RSV, which I presented to you, raise serious moral questions about Jesus' own theodicy. Theodicy is the problem. Y'all tell me, you're theology students here. Who can give me a quick definition of what we mean by theodicy, the theological issue of theodicy? Anybody who's not a professor? So theodicy comes from theos, which means God, and dikaios, it's this language of justice, righteousness. So it's about God's justice. So issues of theodicy, why do bad things happen to good people, right, is the way it comes up. Where is God in this suffering? So it raises serious questions. So the New RSV says this, you'll see on your table, neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. And as you said back here, did God patently cause the man to be born with an impairment in order to use him as a prop in a divine magic show? Does God simply impair the man to use him as the means to an end? What kind of God shows off by curing the very problem that God caused in the first place? And if God does behave this way, why does God choose to cure some congenital impairments and not others? There's certainly never an indication in this story, nor the one we're going to look at 7:30 in chapter 5, that faith is a prerequisite for cure. Because as you said, first of all, he wasn't even looking, parents, where we could tell he wasn't even looking for a cure. So given the ethical gravity of this passage and the way it has really been misused to do a lot of harm, 2 points concerning the Greek text need to be made. First, the ancient Greek manuscripts with which translators work. So we all have this little Greek New Testament, right? So this New Testament that I have is made as an editorial construct. It doesn't exist in the real world, okay? So there's 5,000 manuscripts. Scholars get together, and they view all these manuscripts, and they invent my Greek New Testament to say this is what's the most likely original text, okay? But the manuscripts they work with, our oldest manuscripts, have no punctuation, no spaces in between words, certainly no paragraphs, chapters, verses, etc. Okay, it's just it's called scriptio continua. It's exactly how it sounds. It's just written letter after letter after letter. Paper is expensive, so you just you use up the whole page, right? So all of anything related to punctuation, anything like that in your English Bible is a choice by your translators and editors, and that's the first thing you need to know. So second, The phrase, which the New RSV translates as "he was born blind," does not actually appear in the Greek text at all. So omitting the capitals and punctuation to be true to the Greek text, here's what we have. If I just put into English what's there in the Greek words. Neither this one sinned nor his parents, but in order that the works of God might be revealed in him, we must work the works of the one who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. Okay? It's just all run-on letters together. All right, so I want you to notice the difference in these two translations of verses 3 and 4. First the New and then my own. So the New RSV says, neither this man nor his parents sinned, semicolon. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him, period. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day, semicolon. Night is coming when no one can work. Okay? Look what happens if you punctuate it this way. Jesus says, neither this man nor his parents sinned, right? It's a bad question, so we need to have a different conversation than the one you're trying to have, all right? And then he was born blind, I have in brackets there because it doesn't appear in the Greek text. Okay, so it goes, neither this man nor his parents sinned, so that God's works might be revealed in him, comma, we must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. What's the difference in the second translation? Right, so in this case, when you translate it the way I've translated it, God's not doing anything, right, to anybody. What happens is you have the situation, you come upon this situation, this person happens to be blind, okay? Now Jesus says, okay, here, that's nice, the disciples show up, and as you said, Nicole, they're just talking to each other about this really interesting academic situation. Meanwhile, there's, this person sitting here who's an actual person, right? And while they're sitting here having this whole academic debate, the person's sitting here, and instead, Jesus is saying, okay, we're showing up and we're focusing on this person, and the story actually then moves and focuses on this person and not the disciples, right? And so Jesus, whatever is going to happen in the story with this guy, it's going to be a lesson in how we, the disciples, and then us, obviously, how God's works might be revealed in him, and how we work the works of him who sent Jesus while it is day, right? And I'm going to steal my own thunder here. This is bad teaching, but we don't have time for me to lead you crumb by crumb so you can have an aha moment. So what I want you to look for as the story goes, what is the assumption about what the work is going to be by the end of this story? If you know the story, it goes on, we're going to read it. And he gets healed. Jesus heals the guy. Okay? So in a regular interpretation, what would you consider the work to be that Jesus is talking about in that situation? Yeah, healing, curing a disabled person, curing someone's impairment. Okay, but I want you to listen as we read through the text, and I want you to see if it's not the man himself who actually exhibits doing the works that God has sent Jesus to do, which is to testify to who Jesus actually is in a way that evokes and generates belief in the people around him. Okay, because that's what this gospel asks you to do. There's only one reason this gospel is written, the author tells us in chapter 20, so that you may believe, continue to believe, or come to believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you have life in his name. So who actually does the works of God in this story? So the typical translation is this dude is acted upon, right? The work is done upon him to reveal God's glory, but I would contest by the end, he's actually the one who does the works of the God who sent him. So it is true that in this process of this man's story, it is true that these God's works do get revealed. It's just not the way we're used to seeing it. Are you with me? Okay. So then let's, okay. So let's move on then to the next. Okay. I want to point out just one other little thing, by the way. You know the bit about the mud? He spreads mud on the guy's eyes. What is that a reference to? Where else in the Bible have you heard of dirt from the earth being taken to create life? What does it ring? What does it remind you of? the creation story, right? You remember that? So Adam is literally the earth creature. He's made Adamah from the dirt of the earth, right? And so the Gospel of John loves the book of Genesis. At every turn, it alludes to and draws on Genesis imagery. That's a little side thing to note in there. All right, so reading verses 8 through 12 real quickly. Let's see what, for our purposes, what we care about. Okay, the neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar began to ask, "Isn't this the guy who used to sit and beg?" Some were saying, "It is he," but others were saying, "No, it's somebody like him." He kept saying, "I am the man." But they kept asking him, "Then how were your eyes open?" He answered, the man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' Then I went and washed and received my sight." And they said to him, "Where is he?" And he said, "I don't know." Okay, so the rest of chapter 9 indicates various reactions to the cure. The man's reaction, the neighbors, the parents, and the religious authorities. Notice here that so completely has his community identified the man with his impairment that they are now befuddled, trying to decide whether or not he is the same man. Notice that this guy refuses their binary categories and claims an integrated identity in his response. I am. And by the way, that's just the phrase ego eimi for those of you who know Greek. It actually doesn't say I am the man. It just says I am, which is what Jesus says throughout the text, and it associates this guy as a hero of the story. Right, he's especially tied to Jesus. So the thing to notice here is that he is both the very man who used to sit and beg, and he is something more than that all at once. So moving into our future story, the gospel says, does not mean denying one's former life, and you can see this in other stories. Like most normate gazers, the neighbors identify with him his disability. He does not. For him, he is the same person, blind or sighted. So that is something to notice. One thing I like about, are you all familiar with the CEB, the new CEB translation? So one thing, it's the Common English Bible translation. One thing I like about that translation is it has a commitment to person-first language. So you won't see the blind man, the lame person, right? You'll see the person, either the person who is blind or the person with a visual impairment. Again, because that's a typical thing that able-bodied people do, is identify the whole person with whatever their impairment is. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, I don't know that one. Yeah. Yeah. Got it. Got it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, it's an important thing, and so in the essay itself, the actual published version of this essay, there's a whole conversation about the language, because it depends on who you're talking about, who you talk to, right? So for Justin, for instance, Justin Hancock, he actually likes the language of disabled and non-disabled. In my earlier writings on this, you'll see I use the phrase TAB and versus PWDs. Those are the shorthand, persons with disabilities and temporarily able-bodied. But there's a lot of it. Anyway, we don't have time to talk about that, but know that that conversation exists, because any words you choose, there's no perfect language. And so the temporarily able-bodied thing, or differently able, like some people hate the differently able, because it tends sometimes to just erase it and sugarcoat. and it lets able-bodied people get off the hook. It also makes able-bodied people interested in the subject only from a selfish way, because the idea is temporarily able-bodied. It's the one minority group that if we all live long enough, we'll all actually enter. Unlike me, I'm never going to be African American, right? So in terms of minority, but then folks with disabilities sometimes don't like that because able-bodied people shouldn't be interested in the subject just because they might eventually be disabled, right? It's a very selfish approach to the topic. So anyway, be aware that there's a huge controversial conversation around what is the proper terminology. Yes. Right. Right. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, but thank you. No, thank you for sharing that. There's all kinds. We were talking about this morning with the group that was here. We talked about the cochlear implant debate because folks in the deaf community say we already have a language, we have a whole culture. We don't need. That's the problem with this conversation. Is I was saying this morning, it covers too many different kinds of conditions. First of all, from cognitive issues to physical, as you said, from people who are born, right, with a certain kind of body versus those who acquire that through a tragic accident, who feel that it's tragic because it's a loss, versus somebody who was born without legs and has never lived outside of a wheelchair. So understand this is an overly simplified conversation. And that's actually the point of this, is to just start having conversations and even know there is a conversation and know that there is no such thing as the disability community in a way. It's not as if they're of one piece. Just because you know one disabled person who had one conversation, you don't actually know the whole thing. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Right. Right, right. Which gets into the subject of normate bodies too, because there's a whole conversation in the community of people who can pass and who can't. So I talked to you about Justin Hancock, who's in a wheelchair with cerebral palsy. Jeremy Skipper, who you'll read a lot of Jeremy's work, has CP, has cerebral palsy, but unless you knew, you wouldn't really know. And so how people react. People don't speak louder to Jeremy Skipper when they're around him. So anyway, so I'm sorry, I have to push us on, but this is fantastic, and I appreciate it. That's the whole point. The whole point is to have conversations with people of all embodiments there. And if we had more time to sit down and actually listen to one another and then start to figure out, we're all here. Who are we really? And also invisible disabilities. And then how do we do community? How do we create communities that are welcoming and hospitable to all, and also that tap the spiritual gifts and leadership potential of everybody in the room, regardless of their embodied form. Driving us forward, I'm going to skip some of this and just move forward. But notice that the neighbors, when the guy receives a cure, notice that the neighbors demand an explanation. So I want to point out here that healing often has social ramifications. When one person receives healing, others want to know how or whether it will disturb their own equilibrium. And you're going to see the same fear and lack of support from the parents and the religious leaders. You're also going to notice the neighbors bring the guy to the religious authorities, back to your sense of agency, right? First of all, they're used to, that's another thing that happens with people who are, so people just feel free to just act upon them, drag them. And now he's also cited and they're still doing it. If we had hours to unpack this, that would be great. Let's move ahead though to verses 13 to 17, because it's a long passage. So maybe I'll just won't comment on each passage. So 13 to 17 goes like this. They brought to the Pharisees, again, why are they bringing him? The man who had formerly been blind. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. Then the Pharisees also began to ask him how he had received his sight. And he said to him, he put mud on my eyes, then I washed, and now I see. Some of the Pharisees said, again, notice how this whole thing is divisive. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not observe the Sabbath, referring to Jesus. But others said, how can a man who is a sinner perform such signs? And they were divided. So they said again to the blind man, says New RSV, what do you say about him? It was your eyes he opened. And he said, he's a prophet. Now, what did he first call Jesus the first time they asked? The man called Jesus. Now he's calling him a prophet. Why would he be called a prophet if he cured this guy? What does that have to do with being a prophet? Can you name any prophets you know who did any healing miracles? Yeah. Okay. How about Moses? How about Elisha? How about Elijah? Right, so a lot of times when you're reading this text, people are like, what is a prophet? What does that have to do with anything? So we think of prophet, we don't usually think of somebody doing music. I'm going to actually forward ahead and not even comment. We could comment on other things in here, but let's get back. Let's just keep going. The Jews did not believe, and there's a whole other issue. I would call that the religious authorities. But did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked them, is this your son who you say was born blind? How then does he now see? And his parents, of course, come to the rescue. They stick up for him before the powers that be, defend him. Yes? No. Okay. His parents answer, we know this is our son and that he was born blind, but we don't know how it is he now sees, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he's of age. He'll answer for himself. His parents said this because they were afraid of the religious authorities. For the religious authorities had already agreed that anybody who confessed Jesus to be the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore, his parents said, he is of age, ask him. So here, the Pharisees interrogate the man's parents in order to build a case against Jesus. I think we could all say easily they fail his son. They fail their son here. And here, there are people with disabilities who can relate to this. People who are used to standing alone and against. And sometimes people will question, who's actually more disabled here, the man or his parents, who are literally paralyzed, not literally, figuratively paralyzed by fear, while he speaks truth to power quite boldly. So moving on, 24 to 34. So for the second time, they called the man who had been blind. They said to him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." Now, what's funny is how did the whole passage open up? How this whole story open up? Somebody read verse 1 to me. Somebody read boldly and quickly.
As he walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. The disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents,
Okay.
that he was born blind?"
So first, this dude's a sinner, right? Now we're moving to Jesus being a sinner, right? So he answered, "I don't know whether he's a sinner. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." They said to him, "What did he do to you? How do you open your eyes?" He answered them, "I've told you already, and you wouldn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again?" "Oh, do you also want to become his disciples?" Right? You see how sassy this guy is. Then they reviled him, saying, "You are his disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we don't know where he comes from." The man answered, "Here's an astonishing thing. You don't know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God doesn't listen to sinners, but he does listen to one who worships him and obeys his will. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man weren't from God, he could do nothing." Then they answer him, "You were born entirely in sins, and are you trying to teach us?" And they drove him out. Jesus heard they had driven him out, and when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" What did John 20:31 tell us is the whole point of the gospel, of reading the scripture in the first place? To believe, and not just to believe because you check something off the list and you're like, "Yay, look at me, I'm going to heaven," or like, "Look at me, that's done, I can get my Starbucks," or sacred grounds, whatever. But why? What is the point of believing? To have life, and a certain kind of life. No matter if it's short or long, it's abundant, right? It's a certain kind of life we're going for. So now Jesus asked this guy, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" Whole point of the whole encounter anyway. He answered, "And who is he, sir? Tell me so that I may believe in him." And Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and the one speaking with you is he." And he says what? What does he say? "Lord, I believe." Bingo. He's the paradigmatic disciple of the whole gospel, along with the Samaritan woman, but that's a story for another day. "Lord, I believe," and he worshiped him. In case you didn't understand that he really is believing him as he is, the worship part. Jesus said, "I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see," like this guy, "may see." So, right. "And those who do see," who are physically sighted, "may become blind." Some of the Pharisees near him heard this and said to him, "Surely we're not blind, are we?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, if you were literally blind, like this guy at the beginning, and this guy you're considering a sinner, you wouldn't have sin. But now that you say, 'We see,' your sin remains." So let me make a few comments about this. So this guy obviously acts up. He speaks truth to power here, right? The plot of the entire narrative, actually beginning with verse 1:11 on, involves the quest of the religious leaders to disable Jesus, right? All along, from the very beginning, there's an ominous musical sound in the background. You know they're kind of going after him. And why is that? They want to disable Jesus because of his refusal to accept the unjust, death-dealing, violent terms of normate society. Right? So they turn against this guy and turn on Jesus, right? Demonizing those who refuse to cooperate with hegemonic systems is common, of course. Recall that Jesus is accused of having a demon in the very next chapter, and is a strategy still deployed against people with disabilities today. So in the end of this story, you could, some people who read this story see in it, Jesus, the light of the world, has come into the world and is shining in the faces of the Pharisees. They hate the light and want to do the evil deed of disabling Jesus through death. The man born blind sees the light and does the work of God by believing in Jesus. No matter what the cost, he doesn't care, he doesn't cower. Right? He owns his own experience, he sticks to it, he speaks it, and no one takes it away from him. The Pharisees intuit that Jesus refers to them, and they find it incredible that they, given all their knowledge, status, and power, should be considered blind, which unfortunately is a code word for ignorant here. Jesus disrupts the analogy by indicating that those born blind, as was the man they have just accused of being a sinner, are not sinners. Those who stand judged are the non-disabled, physically sighted, who claim too much for themselves with respect to insight and commit the sin of willful ignorance, not to mention abuse of power and the demeaning of those who are visually impaired. The next thing I do in the essay, and we'll play with this because we're not going to have enough time to do it now, is to watch how scholars, how interpreters, scholarly or otherwise, us, then react to the guy, what they get out of the story and what they don't. And so we can play with that a little bit later. Carrie Wynn he sees the guy as a hero, right, as a totally positive character who does exactly what we just said. He's the one who reflects and actually completes the work of God. Warren Carter, who does a post-colonial reading of, raise your hand if you've ever heard the word post-colonial. Okay, so a lot of people. So he does a post-colonial reading. He wants to ask, first of all, why is the guy even blind? He says it is the right question to ask who sinned. And he says this quote I like. He says, Carter asked the important larger question of the role of social systems in disabling people. He asked this question, who sinned? So it was a bad question when the disciples asked because they assumed it had to do with individual sin. Where Carter says this, who sinned, at least in part, the empire and every politico, economic, cultural, societal system that deprives people of adequate food resources and creates unjust living conditions that damage and disable people. Imperializing power and practices, whether ancient or modern, governments or multinationals, should come with a warning. They can be bad for people's health. The fact that the man was born blind may have to do with economic and social realities such as lack of access to food and nutrition and medicine. His disability may have made him a beggar, as his career options may have been limited. When Jesus cures the impairment caused by poverty, Warren says, he, quote, repairs imperial damage by raising his social class. Wynn argues against that and says the dude seemed like he was totally fine. Like you said, he that's a thing in his society. He seems like he was okay. So anyway, let me mention a few promises and pitfalls. Race through them, kind of. So the promises, I think, so what's liberative about this text, right? First, Jesus corrects the assumptions about impairment and sin. Second, he calls his disciples to work on behalf of those pushed to the margins, socially, religiously, and economically by impairment. He calls them to action and not just contemplation and academic conversation. Third, this nameless man born blind is a hero of faith in the fourth gospel. We already talked about that. He achieves this role. This is important. He achieves this role not by showing that if one has great faith, one can be cured of a physical impairment. He is not a hero because he was cured. After all, the guy in chapter 5 we'll look at was also cured, or because he overcame his disability through pluck and determination. He was not even seeking a cure as far as we know. He is a paragon because when he has a transformative encounter with Jesus, he responds by giving glory to God, becoming a disciple of Jesus, and evangelizing those around him. He himself then shows the fulfillment of Jesus' promise that his disciples would do greater works than he himself did. That is, this man works the works of God by testifying openly without counting the cost and worshiping Jesus with a proper understanding of the gospel's Christology. Like Jesus, after publicly declaring his identity with the statement, I am, this man gets to work for the sake of God. And then fourth, also like Jesus, the man claims his voice, insists on the truth as he knows it, even though those with more education, power, and status try to doubt him and keep him in his place. The text supports acting up on behalf of justice. In terms of pitfalls, we could talk about the use of blindness as a metaphor. I have kind of a lot in here on that. It can be a problem, especially when blindness is associated with ignorance. So blindness as a metaphor, positive or negative, still a problem because it actually erases real life. These kinds of metaphors, and womanists, y'all know what womanists? What's a womanist? Anybody know what a womanist is? Womanist scholars. So feminism was the kind of first. You have feminism that was reacting against. It was bringing the lens of gender to reading biblical texts, right? So reading through a female lens, and then women of color came and said, well, feminist stuff it's fine, but it's largely a white kind of project. So womanism came along after that. Feminists, womanists, folks like this know that metaphors and language, that kind of stuff gets mapped onto real live bodies. And so the language is really, really important. And so when people say, oh, it's just a metaphor, it's not really just a metaphor. It actually ends up having ethical implications for real bodies. Second, cure stories give the impression that everybody with an impairment wants a cure, or at least should want a cure, so that their body can come to resemble the normate body more closely. And this is a problem, I would say. Third, this is important. These people, Snyder and Mitchell, raise important concerns about what they term the limits of redemption narratives. Miraculous healings and resurrections are problematic insofar as they rely on the eradication of disability as a resolution to human-made exclusion. They say, and this is a quote, "The acceptance of disabled people can no longer be predicated on the perverse interests that underwrite fantasies of erasure, cure, or elimination of bodily difference. Such longings for human similitude ultimately avoid, rather than engage, the necessity of providing provisions for our meaningful inclusion, writing from a disability standpoint, our meaningful inclusion in social life." So in a way, wouldn't it have been a better story if the guy had remained healed but uncured? You see? It's a mixing, this is something to, his disability actually gets erased. And so there's a confusion of kind of what the work is that's done and how he's a child of God and what that entails. So that's the kind of thing that they're getting at. So to conclude, with respect to persons with disabilities, the fourth gospel has both liberative and problematic potential in terms of ethics. The emphasis on diversity in creation, that's the prologue we did this morning together. The incarnation, a person who is blind as a hero. The role of the community in healing, that's the Lazarus story we could talk about at 7:30 if you want to. And the ability to seize life, joy, and peace in the present, even in the midst of difficulty, are a welcome balm. But the texts also sound warnings. Empires and societies tend to disable some people. Non-disabled people assume a normate view that disables people with certain impairments. This happens both in the way that non-disabled people narrate stories and in the way they interpret stories. In the process, people with disabilities are often presented as a mere morality lesson and remain objects rather than agents in the plot. Erasure occurs. In the end, by insisting upon material creation as the locus of God's attention and activity, the fourth evangelist emboldens the reader to interpret in ways that promote the flourishing of all, even when the ethic of life entails resisting some of the evangelist's own moods. Thank you. Okay, I'm happy to hang out here. It's 5:34. I'm happy. I understand the hour's up, but I'm happy to hang out, entertain questions, conversation.